Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Norris. I enjoy discussing topics related to human behavior and well being. And today I'm going to prove to you why all cultural values, traditions, customs, and courtesies are a bunch of subjective, made up bullcrap. So I'm going to start by explaining the language that we use to assert moral and social responsibilities. Then I'll explain how the origin of morals and ethics influences that language. Then I'll explain why cultural rules violate the logic supporting that moral language. And I'll wrap it up by explaining how enforcing cultural rules is actually a combination of three different fallacies all at the same time. So, to start, I want you to first think about the way that we use the words should, ought, must, need, or any other word that indicates some sort of imperative action. If you take a while to think about it, I think you'll come to the conclusion eventually that we basically use all of these words in one of two ways. Either we implying a rationally subjective behavior that makes sense given certain conditions, or when we use those words like ought or should, we are referring to a morally objective or imperative behavior that we have a responsibility to accomplish. Let me explain rationally subjective behaviors first. So, rationally subjective behavior is basically something where you use the word ought or should indicate that a certain action makes sense given certain conditions, but you're not under any sort of obligation to do those actions. It's just that it would be kind of stupid if you don't. So, for example, let's say you are feeling hungry, but the only tools and food you have available would basically leave you with no other option than to create a sandwich. Well, if you are hungry and you can create a sandwich and you can't create anything but a sandwich, then it makes sense for you to create a sandwich in that case, right? So I don't think most people in this case would say that you have a moral responsibility to make that sandwich for yourself if you don't actually want to, but it makes sense given the condition. That's what I mean by rationally subjective. So now let's compare that to morally objective behaviors. And when we use the word morally objective or imperative, what we're really saying is that you should feel some sort of obligation to perform a certain action. So, for example, most people would say that if you know your child is in danger and you have the capacity to prevent them from harming themselves, then you have a responsibility to do so. That is something that most people would think of as morally objective or morally imperative. I'll provide more clarification on this after we discuss how morals come to exist. Now, here's where distinguishing objective moral behaviors or responsibilities from subjectively rational behaviors becomes difficult. I know some of you watching this video probably are not religious and have many different feelings on the topic of morality, but I'm going to use a certain terminologies just to simplify the subject for the sake of conversation. So, for the sake of this conversation, we have to agree that there is some sort of objective moral source or authority. Most people, when they think of that, think of God. So, if you do believe in some sort of objective moral authority, such as God, then that means that moral authority is the only place or person from which objective morals can originate from. Objective morals cannot come from any place else. That authority is the originator of all morals. So since we have some sort of moral authority, we can't simply just pull any sort of responsibility or morally imperative belief out of our butts, right? Because if we're allowed to just make up moral rules whenever we feel like it, then who's to say what is good or bad or both? Like, we can't just wake up one day and decide that people should worship the color purple or that torturing babies is morally honorable. You cannot make an obviously incorrect belief like that true, no matter how many people believe it to be true. So now that we've covered the origin of morals, let's go back to the way we use moral language. So if you aren't convinced yet that we use the word should, ought, must, need, or other imperative words in just those two contexts that I've covered, then let me further explain with an example. So let's say you and I are at dinner. And in many parts of the world, it is rude to eat with your elbows on the table. But today, when we're at dinner, I decide to do it anyways. So you notice that my elbows are on the table, you're offended, and you tell me that I shouldn't have my elbows on the table, and then I would respond by saying, says who? And then you would probably respond to me by saying, well, it's just a well known cultural rule. And then I would reply by saying, sure, but who created the rule? Did God create the rule? Then you would respond, no, God didn't create the rule, people created the rule. And then I would say, oh, so the rule did not come from an objective moral authority. You might then respond, no, it wasn't created by an objective moral authority, but you still shouldn't do it. And then I would respond saying, so you're saying I shouldn't do it, but I won't actually be violating any objective moral laws if I do it anyways, because that rule did not come from an actual moral authority, right? So do you see what I did there? So as a result of this example, we can see how basically violating social rules isn't necessarily a violation of moral rules, and you don't necessarily have a responsibility to abide by social customs unless those social customs are actually backed by moral rules. So in this example, following the no elbows on the table rule is just a culturally subjective and rational rule. It's not a morally objective rule because it probably doesn't make sense to, it's subjectively rational because it probably doesn't make sense for us to just go around pissing people off, breaking their cultural norms, especially if following their cultural norms doesn't damage your well-being, but pissing them off unnecessarily probably will damage your well-being. So here's the part where I combine all of this information together to explain why cultural values are a bunch of garbage. Where do cultural values come from? People, right? And societies and groups of people. Are people moral authorities that can just pull morals out of their butts? No. And we've also established that we need a objective moral authority in order to establish objective moral rules. But if people are not cannot be objective moral authorities, and culture is just a bunch of ideas created by a bunch of people, then culture cannot be an objective moral authority. Basically, what I just said is that since no single person can be a moral authority, putting them all together into a big group cannot make them an objective moral authority either. They're just a combination of a bunch of people who have no right to assert new moral rules. The only exception to this is if a cultural rule is basically backed by another objective moral rule that came from an objective moral authority. So say like society does not like murder. Well, murder, you could say, also came from another moral authority. It's not just our society. It's a rule that goes above our society. It's more meta, cumulative, all-encompassing. So what are the three fallacies I mentioned that we commit whenever we appeal to social rules as moral rules? So for one, the appeal to population or ad populum fallacy occurs whenever you claim we should think or behave a certain way just because other people think so. And cultural values are really just subjective made-up rules enforced by people groups over time. And the appeal to population fallacy is almost basic. It's basically very similar or related to the appeal to authority fallacy, because what you're really doing is you're using a larger population basically as an authority on a topic. Since individuals cannot have objective moral authority, and social groups are just basically a combination of individuals, it follows then that social groups also cannot have objective moral authority. Now for the third and final fallacy I'll be covering, the is-ought fallacy states that you cannot claim that something must remain a certain way just because it currently is or has been a certain way in the past. So for example, people will say things like, this is the way we've always done things in our culture and this is the way we must always do things. But simply stating that a people group have always done things a certain way doesn't explain why they do it. And it doesn't explain why they have to keep doing it that way either. Appealing to culture or tradition alone is not evidence for keeping an idea or behavior alive. So now whenever you have to deal with somebody explaining to you why you need to do something based on what their cultural norms are, what they're comfortable with, you can now explain to them why they're committing 3 different fallacies at once. If you enjoyed this topic below, or if you have any further thoughts you'd like to provide, please comment and like and subscribe. Have a nice day.